Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Tony Wasserman, who is a professor in the software management program at Carnegie Mellon University. And Tony teaches courses related to product management, people management, open source, and also his research is very much focused on open source software, software development environments, and software engineering practice for startups. Tony was actually the founder and CEO of Interactive Development Environments, which was a company quite interesting because it was one of the first 100.coms, actually number 78, I think, in order time. I checked, I was curious to see it. And also he worked for other companies as well. And he's a life fellow of the Institute of Electrical Electronics Engineering and fellow of the Association for Computing Machinery. And he has been working since 2015 in the IFIP working group on open source systems, which is the group organizing what is the main research conference focused on open source, the International Conference on Open Source Systems. So thanks for accepting our invitation, Tony, and the floor is yours.
Good, well, thank you very much. It is my pleasure to be here. I'm going to share a screen with you. I hope that all works. So we're going to talk today about finding and learning about open source software. Something I was thinking about before I started here is, in previous conferences, back in the old days when we actually met in person, sometimes I would be giving a talk at maybe 11:30 or 12 in the middle of the day. And I would think to myself, I'm the person who's keeping my audience from lunch. And so I should keep it interesting. But now as I sit here and we run this distributed global conference, I'm thinking that I'm keeping my colleagues here on the West Coast of the US from breakfast. I'm keeping my colleagues on the East Coast of the United States from lunch. I'm keeping my colleagues in Western Europe from dinner, and I'm keeping my colleagues in Kazakhstan from sleep. So that's a lot of burden on me as a speaker, and I will try to do my best to make it worth your time and see where we go. I think in this format, it's easiest if you hold your questions till the end. You can post them in the chat, or you can ask them online when we're done, and I will do my best to respond at the end. So one of the things that we know is that open source is everywhere. We all use it every day, Linux and Firefox and WordPress. I like the video program VLC. We use the MySQL database in lots of our applications. For people who are into cryptocurrency, there's Bitcoin and Ethereum and other cryptocurrency that's all open. There's a company called Synopsys, and they do inventories of software every year, and they've discovered that more than 90% of all software products contain open source code, even if they themselves are not open source. And if you're a developer, you know that you rely heavily on open source projects, whether that's Eclipse as a Java programming environment, or Docker or Kubernetes for containers and deployment. If you took away all the proprietary or all the open source development tools, you wouldn't have so much left. And it's also interesting that the world's most powerful servers run Linux. So you really discover that almost everything you touch has open source in it. Even the entertainment systems that are built into airplanes, turns out that they all run Linux. Now, those of us who come to conferences like OpenCERT have a lot of experience around open source. So some of the things that we know about include things like the history of open source and when the open source initiative was founded and what are the different licenses and how do people use GitHub to store their development work? What are the key open source foundations? Maybe we know how to look up the history of the software development of particular projects on OpenHub. We've all been involved in using and contributing to open source projects, and we know how open source communities work and things like that. But for people who don't have that kind of experience, it's not so easy. They look at open source and it's a completely new thing to them. And if they go to the GitHub page, this is what I found on the front page of GitHub the other day. I didn't sign in as myself or anything. I just kind of looked at it and I said, okay, here's what's popular on GitHub. And there's a link to some project. And here's some people who are trending. I'm not even sure what it means to be a trending developer. So, you know, somebody who's just starting out and has been told to go to GitHub, you know, they look at this and they run in the opposite direction. So that's not really a good thing. And it really symbolizes a key problem that we have, which is that people and organizations often have difficulty finding free and open source software that meets their needs. You know, we kind of live in our own little world of open source, and getting that word out there to other people is not always easy. In fact, one of the key things that I want to point out to everyone is that we have to be much more welcoming. We have to help people understand how open source works. We have to show them what's out there and how they can address their problems and use open source in addition to whatever they're doing now. The same is true of organizations. Organizations run a whole range from having no familiarity with open source all the way to having their own internal open source project office where they have a team of people who manage their open source efforts, who keep track of the inventory of projects and versions that people are using, who work with the legal team in the company to make sure that everything is compliant, to make sure that they understand how open source is being used both internally and in projects that they participate in. And also in many of these companies, they release software for use by others. In fact, they put it on GitHub and they have their own section where people can go and see that software and use it, contribute to it. So companies that are just starting out and organizations that are just starting out, it's a complete mystery. And over a period of years, they get to these higher levels of maturity. I heard a presentation by one of the better known companies in the US, and the speaker talked about a 10-year journey from where they started out with all the management resistance to open source, and to the point where they're now recognized as a significant contributor to the open source community. So these organizations, certainly when they're starting out, have several problems that they have to contend with. The first is that they don't consider open source options at all. They're used to talking to vendors, and they have relationships with the salespeople and technical support people of those vendors. And so when they're looking for something new, that's where they naturally look first. But one of the things you can show people really very early is that they can go to a website like alternative2.net, type in the name of their favorite proprietary program, and see some open source alternatives that sometimes do a pretty good job of matching the capabilities of the proprietary software, and in some of the newer aspects of software do as well or better. So that's a place to look. Another thing is that they don't really know how to evaluate possible candidates. What they have always done in the past is they'll call up their favorite industry analyst, or they'll look at some trade publication, or maybe they'll even go to a trade show back in the days when we had physical trade shows, and they'll read these reviews and they'll get their impressions. But that doesn't work very well for open source software. They don't really know how to evaluate those possible candidates, especially because there are different types of open source software. Some open source software comes out of companies that have simply chosen to make their source code available while earning money from providing services or from having proprietary add-ons to their open source software. One of the things that organizations are used to doing is calling up a vendor and getting a trial or getting some help before they make a buying decision to see how the software works. Now, if they go out and they try to do a search on something like open source content management systems, they're going to get thousands and thousands of hits if they do a search. And they'll discover that there are similarly thousands of content management systems, even open source content management systems. So where do they go from there? Well, maybe they try something like best open source content management systems, and they'll still get a huge list. And then when they pull up one of the lists, what they don't know is that many of the organizations that appear on that list have paid to be there. So it's kind of a strange form of advertising. So basically, they're stuck on how to do evaluation. And the evaluation of open source software is somewhat different than the evaluation of proprietary software. So I asked around some years ago, and I said, well, how do you evaluate software? And of course, I thought about how I do it too. Well, the first one is previous experience. Oh, I've used that before. I know what works. I know what doesn't work. I know how to reach the right people in this company if I have any problems. I might read reviews the same way I might read reviews of hotels or of restaurants or of movies. So some of the reviews are written by people who do that all day, every day for a living. Other reviews are informal. I might, if I'm particularly looking at proprietary software, I might talk to the salesperson for a vendor, ask some questions. Maybe I work in an organization that has set a standard or a mandate, so I don't have to do the evaluation at all. Somebody else in the organization has done it and said, this is what you're going to use. Thank you very much. I might go and participate in a forum discussion. Things like Stack Overflow are really good sites for learning about particular kinds of software and some of the tricks that are out there. Many vendors have their own forums as well. It's not just open source projects that have forums. I might do a personal trial. Many proprietary software products have anywhere from a 4 to a 30-day evaluation period where you can try it out before somebody asks you to pay for it. So you can get a sense of how it works and whether it's going to meet your need. I might also ask a friend or a colleague, somebody who maybe has more experience in that area. And last but not least, I may actually try to do a detailed internal evaluation of several products. Back when we had our own product, as Antonio mentioned, people would want to try out our software and compare it with our competition. And they would make these lengthy evaluation lists of features, and they'd come up with weighting scores for which feature was worth more. And, they'd come up with an overall rating. And if you came out first, then they would pick your product. It's sort of like what a magazine like Car and Driver does when they're trying to recommend what car you should go out and select. Well, the question really boils down to how do you find a worthy open source project? And the question there is, what does it mean to be worthy? Well, to me, a worthy project is one that I can depend on, one that is going to meet my needs and where problems are going to get fixed, where there's a team of people who's actively maintaining the product. Maybe they're putting out new releases. The new releases might be associated with new releases of the underlying platform. So a new version of iOS gets you a new version of the software. And the other thing you can do is you can say, you know, is this a stable core team? I can go to openhub.net, see who's contributed, see how often they've contributed, see how many lines of code they've contributed, and get a sense of the likelihood that that project is going to be around for a while. And of course, it has to meet my own needs. Maybe I have requirements about performance or security. Maybe it has to comply with certain industry standards. If I'm looking at medical computing software, for example, in the United States, there are security regulations that I want to be able to comply with. So all of these things have to go into my thinking when I'm evaluating software. And it's easy to rule out projects that just don't measure up. When I start looking around the projects, one of the things that we discover is that we can go to find thousands and thousands of projects that have been abandoned. People started working on them. Maybe it was for a startup that didn't start up. Maybe it was in school that students were working on a term project. And these things just didn't go away. They stayed in the repository, but nobody has looked at them or written a line of code for them in quite some time. So they're not quite so worthy. So when we go to evaluate proprietary versus open source software, we have to look at what's important about each of those qualities. So when I look at commercial software, if it's enterprise software, something that I'm going to use in my company and maybe spend a lot of money on for the product and for its support and for training and using it over a period of years, things like enterprise resource planning tools or database management tools or accounting systems. Those things have a professional sales team, and the professional sales team manages what amounts to a complex sale because they have to convince the executives of the company, they have to convince the technical evaluators and maybe the finance office. So the process goes through formal trials and maybe price negotiations before the decision is made. And if I'm buying less expensive software, maybe for my department or maybe just for my own personal use, if it's really inexpensive, I'm just not going to worry about it very much. Okay, fine, $5, good. Here's my $5. But when we get a little bit above that, we see that a lot of these inexpensive products have published reviews and paid support. And I look for that. But with open source software, that's not always the case. So if the open source software is led by a vendor, then the vendor may have a community version of it that doesn't come with paid support, but you can go to the website and exchange ideas with people and get help. You may get access to new versions of that software. And you may be encouraged to upgrade from the community version to a paid version because that's how the vendor is going to monetize the work that they've put in on building that software. You also have foundation projects, foundation-based projects. So in the open source world, there are lots of foundations. There's the Mozilla Foundation and the Linux Foundation, the Document Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, and I could go on for quite a while. And each of those is responsible for the stewardship of one or more open source projects. And those tend to be well maintained and well documented. And finally, there are the community-based projects where there's no formal organization behind it. Maybe there's one or more people who take it upon themselves to maintain this software and to make it available to people, maybe to respond to questions and to respond and to requests for upgrades. But they're all a little bit different. So when we look at commercial open source projects, they really resemble in a lot of ways proprietary projects. There's a team of people who are often paid to do the work on the project. You can pay for support and training. There's an end user license agreement that has to, they tend to fall into two categories. There are the open source licenses, ones that follow the open source definition provided by the open source initiative. But if you switch from the open source version to the commercial version, there's a different license. So MySQL is a famous example of that from day one, back in 1994, you could choose to have one license or the other. So if I was starting a company, I would start with the open source license, the GPL. But when I was ready to release a product to people and ask them to pay for it, then I would need to switch to a commercial license and pay for it. Same software, just a different license. So other things that you see with commercial open source projects is there's often a roadmap. So you know what you might expect to find in subsequent releases. There might be a product manager whose job it is to sort out all the different requests and to understand what people want and to see that the product evolves properly. When I go to the foundations, I can see that they have a common license model that they all use. So if you go to the Apache Foundation, you're going to see that the software from the Apache Foundation uses an Apache license, and the software from the Eclipse Foundation uses an Eclipse license, and so on. Now, with this software, you don't go to the Apache Foundation to get commercial support for the product. They don't do that. But that doesn't stop you or me from starting a business that would provide that commercial support. So if you look at a community, if you look at an open source project, you'll see that there are companies that exist just to provide commercial support for those projects. A good example of that is the open source Drupal project, which has been around for about 15 years now. And you can get commercial support for it from Acquia, which has set up as a company and has some of the same people who built the Drupal project in the first place. So you can buy hosted service from them and you can buy support. But there are also a lot of other companies that will build a Drupal site for you, and that's their business. So you can go to companies like Chapter 3 or Pantheon or Lullabot or some others and get support for that open source projects. But what you'll find in these projects is a mix of people who are volunteers and people who are paid. Why would paid people work on an open source project? Well, in this case, a company might decide that a project is of value to them. So they're going to pay people to work on it. A really classic example of that is Eclipse. Eclipse comes out of a development environment project at IBM, but in about 2004, they decided they weren't going to work on it anymore. Their project was not as successful in the marketplace as Visual Studio or some others. And so they decided, well, we'll just make it available to everyone. And they paid some of their own people to work on it to make sure that it was of good quality, but they also have gotten volunteers working on it ever since. Community-based projects are so-called pure open source projects. That doesn't mean that everyone is a volunteer. Some people do get paid to work on it. And for the successful, widely used open source projects, you can think about a core team of committers, people who work all the time to set the direction for the product, to look at contributions and decide which ones should go into the mainstream of the project and which ones have to be sent back to their contributors to be upgraded. These community-based projects may have advocates and evangelists, but they tend not to have a formal paid sales or marketing team. It's really much more word of mouth. Support for these projects comes from discussion forums, some of which are managed by the project itself on places like GitHub, and others in external discussion boards. Even websites like Reddit have discussions around various open source projects. Again, there's support and training available from third parties, not from the project itself, although some of the committers on projects may in fact offer their own services as consultants to companies who want to learn more about it. In terms of scheduling, since you rely heavily on volunteers, and volunteers sometimes find other things in their lives that interrupt them, it's not as easy to produce a schedule there as when you have a commercial product. So historically, people have said it's ready when it's ready, meaning that the release will come. But more and more, these projects are making minor releases and making updates more frequently. There are a lot of popular open source projects that come out of communities rather than out of companies. Scikit-learn is familiar to anybody who's worked on Python development, and people who like to do video production of various sorts or to stream themselves are probably familiar with Shotcut and OBS, which really are competitive with the commercial products that are out there on the market. They're really high quality products. So what we did, starting about 15 years ago, was to try to help these organizations and people with this business of evaluation. So at the time, we created this project called OSS PAL. Actually, we created a project called the Business Readiness Rating. And the Business Readiness Rating is just like it sounds. It looked at open source software projects and tried to help people determine if a project was in fact of good enough quality, if it was worthy. And there was a numerical scoring system set up for it. So you could set your weights or priorities for a particular product, and you could then score different projects. And it was mostly quantitative, but it didn't work. And it didn't work both because of some personal reasons. One of our founders got sick, and one of them moved home to New Zealand. And so, we kind of lost the momentum. We didn't build enough of a community. So some years later, I rebooted the project as OSS PAL. OSS, of course, for open source, and PAL for its double meaning, one as a friend and one for Murugan Pal, who was the co-founder of the project, the earlier project, who got sick and is no longer with us. So what we tried to do with OSS PAL was quite different. We said, people want a short list in a particular category. They want to know which are the 3 or 4 or 5 best projects in a category in terms of their worthiness, in terms of the quality of the software, their longevity, their support, the quality of the code, all of that, documentation, security. And so we said, what we'll do is we'll go out and identify a short list in each category. And we created a list of categories, and we used as a starting point the International Data Corporation's taxonomy. It turns out that they publish every year a list of categories of software. And it turns out to be a pretty good list for applications, and not a terrible and not too bad for infrastructure, but it's not very good for development tools. So we started with that, and we went to create a website that people could go to and look at it. So here's the homepage of OSSPAL. It's still out there at osspal.org. Anybody can go and sign up for it. And we took it upon ourselves to identify what are the evaluation categories that people want to look at for open source software. Now, the first 4 of these are, I think, exactly the same as the categories that people will use for any piece of software. What does it do and how well does it do it, the functionality? How well does it run? Does it scale? Is it reliable? Is it usable? Is it secure? Those kinds of things are questions that we always ask about software. And even if you read the reviews of inexpensive apps for iOS or Android, you'll see that people kind of address those things. They say, well, you know, it crashes too much, or the old version worked better. People want support and service, particularly if they're using the software in some kind of a business critical or mission critical setting. You know, if you can't get support for the software when you need it, then it's not something that you want to depend on. Documentation, of course. So not just help screens, but in some cases, online documents, PDFs and the like. And in some cases, you know, printed hard copy documents, books that you can carry around, and it tells you, you know, exactly what to do. When you look at open source projects, you get some other information that isn't really as easily available if you're looking at proprietary software. You can see how the project is managed, because you can go to the project page in GitHub, or you can go to the summary data in OpenHub, and you can see who's working on it and when they've contributed and how many lines are written in which programming languages. You can see who the committers are. You can see how many versions have been released, how many downloads there have been. So you can get all this project management and adoption information from the project itself. And you may even be able to look at the development process. You can look at the Bugzilla listing, for example, to see how many open bugs there are, how many have been assigned to people, all those kinds of things. So you get a sense of how well the project is being managed. Well, those things give you some additional insight into an open source project that you don't always get from looking at proprietary software. What you see in the proprietary software is, you know, the software itself and its characteristics. Now, when I go out and I look at software, one of my questions is whether I'm evaluating open source or whether I'm looking at all software products. Now, some years ago, there were 2 very distinct camps. There were people who would come to you and say, well, we don't use open source. Even if they were using it, they didn't know that they were using it. And so they would, you know, very righteously tell you that they didn't like open source software. Microsoft in 2005 said things like the open source is a cancer. Well, okay, in the past 5 or 6 years with Satya Nadella taking over at Microsoft, and with their acquiring Red Hat, you know, Microsoft's story now is we're all in on open source. So the world has changed. So for a long time, people would say either we're really religious about open source and we only want to consider open source software. That's kind of the view of the Free Software Foundation. Or we're only going to use proprietary products. But today that's changed. A lot of organizations are saying, look, we want the best software that's out there. And if it's open source, great. If it's not open source, we'll deal with that. So today the idea is, how do we find the best solution? Sometimes it's software that they pay a license fee for, they acquire it, they put it on their own servers, they run it inside their company, and maybe they offer service to others with it. Maybe it's hosted software, something like Salesforce.com, which is proprietary software, but which uses open source extensively. They have really quite a large team of open source people. Another thing is open source software that's on site, so that you've brought it into your organization and you use it. And other is that you use the open source software to host your application for others. WordPress is a great example. A huge number of the world's websites run WordPress. People's blogs are there, information sites of various sorts. You know, it's all open source software, and there are all these themes and modules that are available to add on to it, some free and open source, some not. And so you get this mix of proprietary and open source software. So it's fair to think that most organizations have a mix of these. Now, if you go to OSS PAL, you can see, for example, on the development environments page, there's a list of some open source development environments, and you can click on each of these and it'll take you to a page for that project. And so it'll look something like this. And I don't expect you to be able to read this, but the point I wanted to make is that for evaluation purposes, there are some characteristics of the software that are generic, right? That apply to almost any piece of software. And then there are some characteristics of the software that are specific to its particular category. And so if you're going to do an evaluation, your evaluation is going to deal with both of them. And on this page, it has a link to the project's homepage, has a link to where the download can be found. So now if you would use that software and you wanted to express your opinions about the software, you could rate on a 1 to 5 star basis all of those generic qualities and all of those specific categories and add your own comments. So over time, as more and more people evaluated that particular piece of software, you get an evaluation score that was community-based, and you would get comments that people wrote in much the same way that you can find reviews for movies and hotels and restaurants and other pieces of software that you might find reviews on the iOS and Android stores. Now, OSS PAL really has not gotten a lot of activity. We haven't made a lot of effort to publicize it. So there are other directories of open source software that are out there. The Free Software Foundation produces a free software directory. If you have a piece of open source free software, you can add your listing to it. So what that means is that you have to then evaluate the software itself for its quality. There's no particular curation that's been done there. The open source software directory, which you can find at opensourcesoftwaredirectory.com, does some curation. I think that the list of projects that are there are mostly pretty worthy. That's a good site. And if you're looking for developer tools, the Postmake site is another one that's pretty good, and it's more developer focused. Well, you know, what this suggests is that to be able to evaluate and use open source software and to increase the maturity of your organization and make open source software part of your regular use in life, then you have to know quite a bit. And so among the kinds of things that you would have to know to be an open source expert. First of all, of course, things like the definition of open source and the history of open source. You'd have to know about some of these organizations and foundations that support it. You'd certainly have to be familiar with a lot of the popular applications and libraries for different tasks that you might want to perform. I made up a rule some years ago that asks, what percentage of your life can you spend using open source? Can you go pure open source? And for me, the answer is mostly, but it's not 100%. I do confess that I like to use Photoshop for photo editing, and that certainly is a highly proprietary piece of software. So I'm not 100%, but there are people who are very determined to only use open source software. And some years ago, that was very difficult to do. Today, it's much more feasible than it once was. So to go on with this list of being an expert, it's knowing about development processes, knowing how communities work and how to manage them, knowing about some of the different and popular licenses and what's the difference between a permissive license and a restrictive license, knowing something about the business and the commercial aspects of open source, the support area, for example. And also, if you're in a company, we talked about open source project offices earlier, how do you manage the use of open source in a company, both for internal use and for inclusion in products that you make available to others? So that's a long list of things that you have to learn, and it's not something that you're going to learn overnight. So the question is, where do you learn about it? And I looked around to try to answer that question. And so I came up with several different categories. First of all, there are lots of courses on specific applications. If you want to know how to use WordPress, for example, or Drupal, there are websites and books and individual courses and videos and lots more. And these are available on the project websites or on YouTube or on some of the commercial course sites like edX and Coursera and Skillshare. Long lists. And if you're looking at commercial open source, you often will find that there's training available for a price from the vendor. So learning about a specific project is pretty straightforward. But when you try to go more broadly, it's not quite as easy. When I look at university programs, there aren't many. I've taught a course in open source software at Carnegie Mellon, Silicon Valley for about 15 years, but it's one course, and so in one semester, I try to cram in as much information as I can, but there's no way that I can cover all of the topics that we mentioned, even though I make a lot of use of guest speakers who bring their own perspectives and experience. Brandeis University in the US has started a certificate program on open source technology management. That's 6 short courses to create that certificate. There aren't many organized curricula that you can go around and get. Red Hat, even before they were part of IBM, created a website called teachingopensource.org. It's not very much up to date. And there's another site here, opensource.com, et cetera, that tries to be a guide to free and open source education. I'm uploading these slides. In fact, they're already available. And so rather than you're having to frantically copy down these links, I can assure you that you'll find them on the slides that you can download. So when I looked at this education about open source, I came away with the sense that, gee, there's not much out there. And I tried starting a project called Flossbach, Free Libre Open Source Software Body of Knowledge, BOK. And the idea was to collect from different people information about open source software. So it would be kind of a community written book that was edited by a small number of people on an editorial board to make sure that the content was well done and readable and consistent. So again, that's a project that we haven't gotten very far with, but you can go out there and look at it at flossbach.org, and anybody who wants to be involved in contributing, that would be great. There also are some leading conferences on open source. Here are 5 or 6 of them. The Open Source Summit that the Linux Foundation runs is probably the best known and the most widely available, because they run a version in the US, they run a version in Europe, they run a version in Japan they used to run all these every year before we came to a halt. And I assume that someday soon we will be back to those. There's a good conference called Open Source India that has a 15 or so year history. It's now called Open Source India. In Australia, there's the Linux conference that comes in January every year, about the same time as the Australian Open, for those of you who are tennis fans. So you can combine the two. There's a conference in France, which is now called Open Source Experience. It was originally called Open World Forum, and they ran their first open source experience just last month. GitHub runs its own conference, mostly around how to use GitHub. And then Professor Cerrone mentioned the International Conference on Open Source Systems. That's a research-focused conference. So this is a way to learn more about the research, and the other conferences let you meet people, and some of them have exhibits and demonstrations of open source software. So it's a good place to build contacts and community. There's some other learning resources. I want to point out particularly the work of the To-Do group, which for organizations is just great. It has a lot of the best open source practices for companies, and a series of guides that you can find on the To-Do group's page, and they'll tell you everything about licensing and how to contribute to projects and how to start projects. There are about 10 or 12 different guides. And one of them has kind of grown up into how to start an open source project office. And they keep that on GitHub under OSPO 101. And it's you can go there and find the series of lessons and content and use them for yourselves. Well, we've used most of the hour, so I want to leave you with a few takeaway ideas. First of all, using open source is a practical and a business choice these days. It's not something that requires any kind of a religious commitment to free software on your part. It's just that sometimes the best solution is the open source solution, not just financially, but because it's the most solid, best supported, most widely used product in a category. As you've seen, open source and proprietary software can coexist. If you have a permissive license, you can even include open source software in a proprietary product. But you have to watch out. Some software is called open, but it's not really open. They've changed their licenses. They've come up with things that are almost open, but they don't comply with the open source definition. And there's some business reasons why these companies have done it. And we don't have time to go into all of that now, but there are a lot of these kinds of things, so be careful. And if you're going to use open source software, don't just be a taker, don't just use it, but become part of the community. So contribute your requests for enhancements, maybe contribute code, maybe go out on the discussion forums and answer questions that other people have, maybe do translations, because there are a lot of languages out there in the world, and most of these products are not available in a lot of different languages. So there's a lot that you can do to be part of that community. I think that's probably a good stopping point. I want to wish everybody safe and healthy next year. Hope that the holidays are good for you, and we have a lot of things to be thankful for next year, not just a vaccine. So with that, this finds me. And I'm in San Francisco, so this also finds me. This is a picture I took last month. The temperature was about 15 Celsius. So this is the Golden Gate Bridge from the Pacific Ocean side, not from the San Francisco Bay side. So those are actually ocean waves coming up. With that, let me stop. I'll be glad to answer questions, and I want to thank those of you who stayed for your staying. I'm going to stop sharing the screen so I can see all of you better for any questions you may have. Thank you again very much.
Thank you very much, Don. It was really a very interesting and beautiful talk. Actually, the time flies. I didn't even realize that if you didn't tell me that it was almost 1 hour, I wouldn't have realized it because I was very much involved. Okay, are there questions? You touched a lot of topics, so we could have actually quite a number of questions. Anyway, yeah, there is some...
I might. Okay. Yeah, thank you again, because it was really very comprehensive. Of course, there are many aspects that can be deepened, so to say. I just wanted to ask you an evaluation, considering that you are knowing this area very much. I don't know, with respect to 10 years ago, 15 years ago, how is the spread of open source, of the real applications of open source nowadays? What kind of trend can we imagine for the
yeah, so I think that you know, what we saw in the past 10 to 15 years was a really exponential growth in the adoption and use of open source software. And we saw that many of the driving factors, the software for machine learning, for example, was very heavily based on open source. People who are managing large data sets use things like Hadoop or its commercial equivalent to manage data sets. Companies like Facebook and Google and many others produced really high quality software and made it open source. So you can use Cassandra, and again, there's a commercial support for it. And so what we see is that more and more people are simply jumping into their application domain and finding that the tools of choice are open source. MongoDB for a long time was open source. They changed the license because there's some business issues with third-party vendors hosting MongoDB and making all the money rather than Mongo making any money. So that was an issue for some of these projects. But now I think we're closer to a stable state. That is, we're going to see lots of projects that are available, some open source, some proprietary, some a combination that you have a solution which has maybe an open source backend and a proprietary front end, for example, that are separately built. Because I think that the war between open source and proprietary is mostly over. And I think open source has won, but open source has won not in the way that it wiped out proprietary software, because if you go to your mobile devices, there's almost no open source there at all, except for Android itself. There are very few open source applications for Android compared to the proprietary apps. You can go to a site like F-Droid, which has 26,000, I think, open source Android projects compared to many, many millions of proprietary ones. And on iOS, it's even more the other way. iOS software is proprietary. And who's to say? I mean, I use a Mac. this presentation comes to you on a Mac, and it runs layers of proprietary software, a lot of which derives from open source. So yeah, I think people pay less attention to it now from a strength of vision standpoint than they once did. And I think it's going to stay that way. Sorry, that's a long answer to your short question.
Okay.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
I have a question.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So the tool that you described, OSS PAL, it's evaluating the software, software project, but there was some metrics that is impossible for me to imagine how can be evaluated like systematically or stuff. Like, for example, reliability of a project. How can we measure the reliability of the project? Like, which numerical values could tell us about this?
Yeah, that's a good question. And the short answer is that you can't. But if I tell you, make a short list of operating systems, you're going to say, Linux or some flavor of Linux, and Mac OS, and maybe Windows 10. I don't know about Windows 11 yet. And we kind of think of it the same way. If I ask you for what's a reliable database management system, you might say Oracle, and you might say MySQL, or MariaDB, which of course derives from it. And coming up with quantitative measures is not easy. I mean, what's the mean time between failures is really the key question, and it's hard to do that. So what we tried to do was to kind of follow this, I don't know, this sense of which ones had been around the longest and were the best used and best reviewed, to put those into our short list. But we also left, and I didn't say this, but we also left a way for users of the site to propose additional tools to be included in our list. And we came up with an informal way to evaluate those tools in terms of their popularity and quality. But the last point is that we've not devoted enough time and effort to OSS PAL, and the kinds of questions you ask are things that really are worthy of future research, and we'd like to get that project supported and moving forward again. Thanks for your question.
Thank you for answering. Yeah. Also, wouldn't it be like useful if, for example, such good platforms such as GitHub will somehow work like working with them? For example, like it would be probably also beneficial for them to provide more and evaluative metrics, like provide some tools for measuring such metrics and so on, like collaborating with them.
Yep. So there are a couple of issues here. First of all, GitHub does use a star system. So if you like a particular project that you're using, you can assign it a star. And so you can go out on GitHub and find projects that have lots of stars. And, is that a reliable metric? Well, yes and no. I mean, because certainly if I was running a project on GitHub, I could go out and ask all my friends and to give it a star, and ask them to ask their friends to give it a star. So it's not exactly the world's most reliable system. But the other thing is that when you go to GitHub, there are millions of projects. And as I said earlier, many of them, you don't really know their status. You don't know whether they've been abandoned completely because they were student projects and they're all done, or whether somebody started on them and then life interrupted them and they want to come back to it. And if you look at it next year, it'll have advanced. So it's really not easy to do that. That's really my sense. So how are we doing on time? I've used an hour, so.
Okay, so if there is no other question, maybe I would like actually to ask a couple of questions. So you mentioned that the war between proprietary software and open source software, in a way, it's over, and open source software has won. But on the other hand, I was thinking, yes, but when there was this war, people could actually choose and see exactly what was open source software and what was proprietary software. Now there are all these kind of hybrids way, pseudo open source software, which actually is not like that, because I mean the license change. So there is a kind of confusion, and in my feeling is that it's even more difficult nowadays with this situation to choose, because we don't really know whether the software is really open source or not sometimes. I don't know, what is your opinion on this point?
So yeah, there's a whole conference about this. There's a conference called the Open Core Summit. And if you go to oss.capital, CAPITAL, you can see this list of companies that are, many of them in this in-between situation. But on the one side, it's still possible to identify open source software. Those are the ones that use an approved open source license, like we talked about, the GPL or BSD or Apache or something, and those that don't. And what we've seen is that some of the ones that were once open source no longer are, and they've created what I would call a new end user license agreement. It's just like the end user license agreement that Microsoft sends you when you get Microsoft Office, for example. It's just that their license agreement looks similar to open source licenses, but isn't. So yes, it does take a little bit of detective work. And if you are one of those people who is very careful about staying with open source software, then here's a new collection of software to reject. But most people are not quite that fussy. They use open source software and they don't know that it's open source. Oh, what browser do you use? Oh, I use Firefox. They're not going to download the source code. They're not going to read the source code. They're not going to contribute code. They're just going to use it as their browser because it provides the best security and the best protection against tracking of all the browsers that are out there. Certainly much better than Chrome, which comes from a company that's in the business of collecting information about you.
That's right. And actually this comes back to the other point, which is education. So it's important to understand what is really open source software in order to make the right decision. And so it is important also to, I believe, to have open source software education within a university environment, which is not very common. I know you run a course on open source software, I ran a course, but it's not a common thing. I mean, many universities don't do that. And also, my feeling is that, when you teach such a course, you need to involve students in participating. But on the other hand, you are in a formal education environment. So if you actually put this participation in a context of a university course, you violated the freedom that you should have in open source software.
Yeah, no, we make it work. I'll tell you what we do. students who come into this class, and I limit the number of students because I have just so many hours in the day to do this. There's a certain amount of material that I present. There's a certain number of guests whom we invite in, people who have different perspectives and different experiences, some in companies and some on projects. And every student has to do a project. And that project, in many cases, students want to go join an existing open source project. So for a period of 3 months, they can identify a project that's out there that they want to work on. I had last year a couple of students who were interested in art. And so they went out and they found projects that were doing art. And they joined those projects and they studied the code and they made their contributions. And in one of the 2 cases, their code got put into the main line of the project. So they came away understanding how open source projects work and the fact that each one has its own personality, and that they did this in the context of school. They could continue working on the project after they were done with the class if they wanted to. And everybody got up at the end of the course and gave their little 5 or 6 minute presentation about what they did and what they learned. So I think it's really very easy to combine a real world experience with the material that you might present in a series of lectures. Because if it's just a series of lectures, I can put those all on YouTube and say, here, go watch this. And it's the other stuff that's the added value of coming to the class.
Okay. Yeah, actually, you describe a course which is similar to also what I run, but still I have, sometimes you have the doubts that you are doing the right thing or not, basically.
Well, you have to be confident and you have to have some faith in your students. I mean, your students, in my case, the class is an elective class. So they want to learn about open source software. So, if they wanted to get an easy high grade, they wouldn't take this class. They'd take something else. So they're going to come into this class and they're going to discover right away that much is expected of them, and and they're going to do it. So the best I can tell you is that when we do the evaluation of the class, it gets a very high score. People find that the class is worthy. And I'm very proud of that.
Okay. Well, I think now we spent quite a lot of time, so probably you have to still to go to breakfast, I understand. So probably we should leave you free to start your day.
I'm good.
And, so really, thank you very much again. It was really an interesting and involving talk, and I think we learned all a lot from what you said. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. I look forward to staying in touch, and thanks to everybody who came and stayed with it till the end. I hope you have a good holiday, and let's hope that 2022 is a good year for everybody. Take care now. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay.